My name is Emma Walker, and I want to tell you a truth that took me years to understand. You don't lose your voice all at once. You don't wake up one morning suddenly broken. No, it happens slowly, quietly, gently. It happens in moments so small that you don't even realize what's happening to you. I lived inside a marriage where my voice didn't matter. Not because I couldn't speak, but because the man I loved stopped listening. And the worst part? I didn't fight back. I didn't ask questions. I simply adjusted myself, convinced myself that silence was easier than conflict. This is the story of how a woman gets erased while still being alive, still smiling, still pretending everything is fine. It's the story of how I disappeared and how I found myself again. I met Daniel when I was 25 at a small dinner party in Chicago hosted by a mutual friend. I remember the warm lights, the soft jazz music, the smell of baked garlic bread filling the apartment. Daniel was charming in that effortless way, calm voice, steady eyes, polite smile. When he sat beside me, it felt strangely comforting, like I had known him before. He asked questions, not the usual ones, but thoughtful ones. Questions about my hobbies, my dreams, my fears, my childhood. No one had asked me things like that in years. I walked home that night replaying his words, his smile, the way he made me feel seen. If someone had told me that night that he would one day make me feel invisible, I would have never believed it. Our relationship in the beginning felt like a movie. Late-night drives, weekend trips, long phone calls until 3 a.m. Daniel made me feel like I mattered. He said he loved my paintings, my laugh, my messy notebooks full of ideas. He used to say, "Emma, you're the most genuine person I've ever met." I believed him. I trusted him. 6 months later, when he proposed under the city lights with a small ring and trembling hands, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. I didn't know back then that the person who loves you the loudest in the beginning can sometimes silence you the most in the end. The first shift was so subtle, I almost missed it. It was just a single sentence. I remember telling him excitedly about a promotion opportunity at work. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't congratulate me. He just looked at me and said, "Do you really think you can handle that much responsibility?" I laughed awkwardly, thinking maybe he was joking. But his face stayed serious. And something inside me tightened. I pushed the discomfort away, telling myself he was just concerned for me. That's how it starts. One comment that you swallow, one disappointment you ignore, one moment where you choose love over your own voice. Painting had always been the purest part of my life. It was my escape, my peace. One weekend, I spent nearly 10 hours working on a piece. My fingers were stained with paint, my clothes messy, but my heart was full. I couldn't wait to show Daniel. I held the canvas like it was a piece of my soul. He stared at it for barely 2 seconds and said, "The colors don't really match." And he walked away. I stood there, holding my painting, feeling foolish. I told myself it was fine, that maybe he wasn't in the mood. But that night, I put the painting in the closet and I didn't paint again for weeks. Slowly, without any big fights or dramatic moments, I started changing. I stopped wearing bright colors because Daniel liked neutrals. I stopped making weekend plans unless he initiated them. I stopped talking about my work because he rarely asked. I began shaping myself around his moods, his preferences, his comfort. Every time he made a dismissive comment, instead of standing up for myself, I shrank a little more. I lowered my voice, softened my opinions, erased parts of myself just to avoid conflict. Love isn't supposed to feel like walking on eggshells, but I didn't realize that then. I thought compromise meant silence. I thought love required shrinking. Daniel wasn't cruel. He never yelled, never insulted me, never raised his hand. That's what made everything harder. Emotional neglect is quiet. It's the absence of warmth, the absence of interest, the absence of appreciation. It's having someone beside you but feeling completely alone. There were evenings when we sat on the couch together, both scrolling on our phones, not saying a single meaningful word. And I blamed myself for it. I kept thinking, maybe I'm boring. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I expect too much. That's how emotional neglect traps you. You don't even realize you're being starved because the person starving you does it silently. One cold winter night changed everything for me. I cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta, garlic bread, salad. I waited for Daniel with a hopeful heart, thinking maybe we'd talk tonight. Maybe he'd ask how my day was. Maybe he'd notice me. He walked in, tired, distracted, barely looked at me. He tasted the food and said, "It's fine." Just one word. A word colder than the winter outside. After he went to bed, I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes with shaking hands, realizing that I couldn't remember the last time he looked at me with love. Not passion, not affection, just love. That night, I sat in the dark living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the silent walls. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. When did I stop being me? I used to be bright, expressive, creative, full of life. Now I was quiet, anxious, careful, tired. Exhausted from trying to be enough for someone who didn't see me. Exhausted from explaining my worth to myself. Exhausted from pretending everything was fine. A week later, my sister Laura visited. She rang the bell with her usual bright smile, but the moment she hugged me, she froze. She pulled back, looked into my face, and said softly, "Emma, you look drained." Not tired. Drained. Empty. She sat with me for hours, talking, trying to make me laugh, but my voice felt weak, like it belonged to someone else. At one point, she held my hand and whispered, "You don't sound like yourself anymore." And for the first time, I let the truth in. I had lost my voice somewhere in this marriage, and Daniel never even noticed. The next morning, for the first time in years, I looked at myself in the mirror and really saw the woman staring back. My eyes looked dim, my posture weak, my smile forced. It wasn't age, it was emotional exhaustion. I had been holding a weight I wasn't built to carry. And it wasn't Daniel's silence that was crushing me, it was my own. I kept allowing it. I kept accepting it. Laura's words echoed in my mind. "You don't sound like yourself anymore." I wondered, what did I even sound like now? When was the last time I laughed genuinely? When was the last time I spoke without fear of being dismissed? The truth felt heavy, but strangely freeing. A part of me whispered, "Emma, this isn't living." That day, while Daniel was at work, I opened my old art closet, something I had avoided for months. The air smelled like old paint and turpentine, but it felt like home. I found my abandoned canvas, the one Daniel had dismissed with a cold comment. The colors were still bright, bold, loud. They looked like the version of me I used to be. I touched the dried paint with my fingertips and felt tears falling. Not because of Daniel, but because I realized I had stopped valuing my own creations. I let someone else's indifference rewrite my worth. And in that moment, I made a small promise to myself. I will paint again. That evening, when Daniel returned, he didn't notice the paint on my fingers or the canvas leaning against the wall. He barely said a word during dinner. And something inside me changed. Instead of feeling hurt, I felt observant, detached. I watched the man I once loved more than anything, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel. But he didn't appreciate me. He didn't care about my passions, my dreams, my growth. He was comfortable with the version of me that stayed quiet. And I finally understood that silence wasn't keeping the peace. It was destroying me. A week later, Laura sent me a message. "Come to my place this Saturday." I want to show you something. When I arrived, I walked into a small room filled with candles, soft music, and a painting on the wall. My painting. One I had gifted her years ago. Laura smiled and said, "This hangs here because it inspires me every day." Do you know why? Because it reminds me of the fire you had. I stood there staring at it, and I felt something stir inside me. A memory. A spark. A piece of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Laura hugged me and whispered, "Please don't let marriage dim your light." For the first time in years, I cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. When I returned home that night, Daniel was irritated. "Where were you?" he asked sharply. "At my sister's," I replied calmly. "You should have told me." "I did," I said. "You didn't hear me." He frowned, confused. And that confusion told me everything. He genuinely didn't notice my existence unless it affected him. That night, lying next to him in silence, I realized we weren't a team. We weren't even connected. We were just two people sharing a roof, breathing the same air, living different lives. And I wondered how long I would keep pretending this was enough. The next few weeks felt different. I woke up earlier. I painted every morning. I listened to music I used to love. I cooked meals I liked. I took long walks alone, letting the cold Chicago air clear my mind. Daniel noticed the changes, but not in the way I hoped. "You've been distant," he said one evening. "I'm just taking care of myself," I replied. He didn't like that answer. Daniel liked me best when I needed him. And I suddenly realized I didn't need him anymore. One evening, I came home to find him sitting at the dining table, arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said. I sat down across from him, steady and calm. "What's going on with you? You're different." I took a deep breath. "Daniel, I'm exhausted. I've been exhausted for years." He blinked, stunned. "Because of me?" "Yes," I answered honestly. It was the first time I had said it out loud. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. "I feel alone in this marriage." His face tightened. "You're overreacting." And that single sentence told me everything I needed to know. After that conversation, something broke. Not in a painful way, but in a revealing way. I finally understood. I had been begging for emotional crumbs from a man who didn't even realize I was starving. And the more I healed myself, the more distant he became. The marriage had been held together by my silence. Now that I was speaking, everything was falling apart. But strangely, I didn't feel scared. For the first time, I felt awake. One cold morning, I stood by the window watching snowflakes fall. The world outside looked peaceful. Inside, my heart felt clearer than it had in years. And I realized something I had never dared to admit. I don't want to spend the rest of my life unseen. I deserve presence. I deserve attention. I deserve love that doesn't make me feel small. Daniel walked past me without a word, and I whispered to myself, I won't live like this anymore. I decided to see a therapist, not to save my marriage, but to save myself. The therapist listened quietly, then said something that shook me. "Emma, you've been disappearing for years, but the fact that you're here means you're ready to return." That sentence became my anchor. Every week, I untangled a piece of my past, moments when I stayed silent, moments when I made myself small, moments when I believed I wasn't enough. And slowly, I began reclaiming my voice one session at a time. Therapy opened doors inside me that I didn't know existed. I started questioning things I had always accepted. Why did I feel guilty for wanting affection? Why did I think my needs were too much? Why did I keep shrinking every time Daniel dismissed me? My therapist said something powerful. People don't silence you. You silence yourself to keep peace that doesn't even exist. Those words hit me harder than anything. I realized I had been negotiating with myself for years, convincing myself that my loneliness was normal, that all marriages eventually become quiet. But there's a difference between peaceful silence and painful silence, and mine was the latter. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the truth instead of hiding from it. Daniel noticed the changes, but not in a loving way. He became irritated, restless. "You talk differently now," he said one night. "No," I replied. "I'm finally talking." He stared at me like I was a stranger. That scared him more than anything. He liked predictable Emma. Soft-spoken Emma. Not the Emma who asked questions. Not the Emma who wanted to be heard. One evening, he said with a frustrated sigh, "Why are you making everything dramatic?" I smiled sadly. Because I finally realized my feelings matter. That was the first time he didn't have a response. I started spending more time with my sister, taking small steps toward myself. We went to art galleries, coffee shops, even a morning yoga class. Every time I laughed, it felt foreign but good. Like rediscovering a language I once spoke fluently. One afternoon, Laura held my hand and said softly, "You're glowing again." It wasn't makeup. It wasn't happiness. It was freedom. Freedom from the weight of silence I had been carrying for years. But healing yourself comes with unexpected grief. One night, I was preparing dinner and suddenly broke down crying. Not because of Daniel, not because of the marriage, but because I realized how deeply I had abandoned myself. There were pieces of me everywhere, pieces I had left behind in arguments I never had, tears I never cried, dreams I never pursued. I cried until my chest hurt. And for the first time, I didn't wipe my tears away quickly. I let myself feel everything I had buried. It wasn't weakness. It was resurrection. A few days later, Daniel finally asked, "Are you unhappy with me?" It was the most honest question he had asked in years. I looked him in the eyes and said, "Yes." He froze. He expected excuses, explanations, something softer. But truth doesn't come wrapped in cushions. He whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" I laughed softly. "Daniel, I've been telling you in 1,000 silent ways." He didn't understand. People who never listen don't notice the quiet cries. They only notice when silence becomes strength. The next morning, Daniel tried to be nicer, small gestures he hadn't made in years. He made coffee. He asked about my day. He complimented my hair. But something felt off. It wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing the version of me that made life comfortable for him. Real change comes from awareness, not desperation. And I knew his kindness was temporary, like a bandage placed on a wound that needed surgery. One evening, while I was painting, Daniel walked in and said, "You're spending too much time on this hobby." That word, hobby, cut deep. Art wasn't a hobby. It was a lifeline. I looked at him and said, "Painting makes me feel alive." He shrugged. "I just don't want it to take over your responsibilities." I finally realized his problem wasn't my art. It was my independence, my growth, the parts of me that didn't revolve around him. And I knew then he didn't want a partner. He wanted an accessory. During therapy, my counselor asked me one question that changed everything. "Emma, if your sister lived the life you are living, would you tell her to stay?" I didn't even hesitate. No. The shame hit me instantly. Why was I allowing myself to live a life I wouldn't want for someone I loved? And then it struck me. I didn't love myself enough. But I was learning. Slowly, painfully but surely. One Sunday morning, while cleaning the attic, I found a box of old photographs, pictures of me smiling, traveling, painting, dancing in the rain, laughing with friends. The woman in those pictures looked free, fearless, alive. I sat on the floor holding those photos, trembling. Where did she go? When did she disappear? And more importantly, was she still somewhere inside me, waiting? I decided then. I would bring her back. That evening, I sat with Daniel on the couch and said softly, "I think we need space." He laughed awkwardly. "Emma, marriages go through phases. It'll pass." "No," I said. "This isn't a phase. It's a pattern." He grew silent, then angry. "So what? You want to separate?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was terrifying. But finally, I whispered, "I want to find myself, and I can't do it here." He stood up, pacing. "You're being dramatic." But I wasn't. For the first time in my life, I was being honest. The next week was a storm. Arguments. Cold silence. Tears. Accusations. Daniel didn't understand how he had lost me because he never understood how he had never truly had me. He thought presence meant partnership. He thought stability meant connection. He thought silence meant peace. But I was done living in a quiet war. And I wasn't going back. I moved out. Just a small apartment downtown. High windows, plain walls, creaky floors. But it felt like the first breath after years underwater. The first night alone, I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, eating cheap takeout, tears rolling down my face. I wasn't crying because I missed him. I was crying because I finally chose myself. And that choice was beautiful and terrifying. In my new apartment, I painted again. Not cautiously, not secretly, but loudly. Colors everywhere, on my arms, my clothes, my walls. I painted the woman I used to be, and the woman I wanted to become. I realized healing isn't a moment. It's a series of small rebellions. Choosing peace over fear. Growth over stagnation. Your voice over silence. Daniel visited once. He stood outside my door looking lost. "I didn't think you'd actually leave," he said quietly. "I didn't think I'd ever be brave enough," I replied. His shoulders dropped. He wasn't angry anymore, just confused. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. "Yes," I said softly. "But loving you meant abandoning myself. And I can't do that anymore." He nodded slowly, realizing this wasn't temporary. It was goodbye. Months passed. I built a new routine: morning coffee, painting sessions, therapy, long walks, small joys. My smiles became real again. My voice became clear again. One morning, looking in the mirror, I saw her, the old Emma, returning. Not fully, but enough. Enough to know I was healing. Enough to know I had made the right choice. One afternoon, while painting in the park, a stranger approached me, a woman in her late 40s. She watched silently for a moment and then said, "There's emotion in your strokes. It looks like you've lived a story." I smiled. "I have." She nodded. "Keep painting. It's saving you." I didn't tell her this, but she was right. One night, sitting alone with a cup of tea, I realized something. I wasn't lonely. Loneliness is when you miss someone else. But solitude is when you find yourself. And for the first time, solitude felt like home. The silence that once suffocated me now comforted me. Weeks later, I hung my paintings in a small local art cafe. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted to celebrate the woman who survived. The woman who returned. The woman who spoke. When people admired the artwork, they weren't just praising the colors. They were admiring the courage behind them. Sometimes Daniel texts. Short messages. "Hope you're well. I miss you." But I don't reply. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some chapters aren't meant to be revisited. Some doors must stay closed. And some silences are healing. So here I am telling my story, not because it's dramatic, not because it's tragic, but because it's real. Women disappear in marriages every day, not physically, but emotionally, quietly, slowly, until one day they wake up and realize they don't recognize themselves anymore. But here's the truth. You can find your voice again. You can rebuild your life. You can return to yourself. I did. And if you're listening to this, maybe, just maybe, this is your sign. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be loved, especially by yourself. And before I end this story, if you are a woman who has lived through something similar, if there is a pain you've kept inside for too long, if there is a truth you've never been able to say out loud, then remember this. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you deserve to be heard. If you feel ready to share your experience with the world, you can send us your story. Just write to us at voicesofwomenstories@gmail.com. Your identity will be kept completely private. Your words may help another woman feel less alone. Your story could be the strength someone else needs. So, if life has ever broken you, or changed you, or taught you something powerful, we're here to listen. This is Voices of Women. Real stories. Real pain. Real strength.